32, you are to give the right thigh of your fellowship offerings to the priests as a contribution. Okay, now this may seem like one thing on top of the other, but it's actually, these have different meanings. Verse 33, the son of Aaron who offers the blood and the fat of the fellowship offering shall have the right thigh as his share. And from the fellowship offerings of the Israelites, I have taken the breast that was waved, and the thigh that is presented, and given them to Aaron the priest and his sons as their regular share from the Israelites. So there are three different things going on in this part of the offering that God says, hey, this is important. Okay? The first part is the fat that comes. Okay? The fat, if you want to read more about it, it's not only in 22 through 27, but it's also other places, both in Leviticus and throughout the Torah. The fat and the blood are something that the people are never supposed to have in that kind of way. Okay? The blood represents the life being in it, and the fat has a richness to it that's like the choice parts. You know, when you cook a good steak that's got that ribbon of fat on it, instead of getting the lean meat that doesn't have that, it's so much better, isn't it? Because you have that richness that's in there, just all the flavors that come together. And God says, that part is mine. I get to have that. You may say, well, wait a minute. Okay, first, he's God, right? We give him the best. But also, a lot of toxins and other stuff like that are stored in the fat of animals. And so when you have a people that doesn't have some of the same kind of sanitation stuff that we do, and this is not even to reach into the New Testament with the sheet coming down out of heaven and everything else, and God saying, you know, you can have this now. This is in the terms of God taking care of his people. If you cut out the fat and that's taken away and that's given to God as his part, it means you're eating less of that, right? Which is a physical health protection for them because they're not taking in those toxins in the same kind of way. So God's saying, not only give this to me because it's good, but actually in what he's doing, he's blessing them, and they probably don't realize it in the same kind of way. So many of the ways that God provides for us, we don't understand them. And we can look at it and say, God, why do you want me to do fill in the blank? And for them, you can wonder about somebody at this time saying, okay, I understand this is the richest part, but why? Not getting an answer, and it's still a will I do it or will I not do it? And hopefully they go and sacrifice. Later on, we come along with science, and we're able to say, here's a reason, but it doesn't change the initial fact. In fact, obeying without knowing the reason is often more of a step of faith, because you have to look at it and say, it's not because of this, it's because God said to do it. And I'm going to trust him one way or another. You're going to encounter stuff that you read, if you're going through the Torah, that's like this. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Why? He doesn't say. But you're right, Nancy, because God says so. The imagery of that, to the thing that would be a provision for that kid in that way. It's almost, the picture is just wrong on so many levels. But at the same time, God said it. And I haven't studied into that specifically, no, here's a scientific reason, but I don't need to have that in that kind of way. This does, at the base of it, come to a, did he say it this way or not? And if he did, are you going to trust him and are you going to follow him? And so many things that we worry about can really come down to just that base foundation of the other stuff doesn't matter in some ways. It does. It's nice to know. But it shouldn't sway us beyond, did God direct me to follow him or not? And if I have nothing else, that's my foundation. And so when you get to Eli's sons, they know this. They've grown up in this. In fact, who's the one responsible to teach them about these things? Eli. Eli and all of the other priests. In fact, even if you're not part of the priests, the Levites are probably around this enough that they know. They know how all of this is supposed to work. This is their life. They're in the middle of this. The breast part, okay, the fat's God's. It gets burned up. In fact, it gets burned up on the altar with with the burnt offering. You can read more in this as far as the crossover of some of the stuff. It's really cool. But it literally gets burnt up. The breast part gets lifted and waved in front of God. At that point, that belongs to God. So God then pivots and says, for the priest, I'm going to provide you with this so that you have sustenance to eat. The thigh comes from the people. You see that in the text? Look back down here. The priest, in fact, let me go back up to 30. With his own hands he is to bring the offering made to the Lord by fire. He is to bring the fat together with the breast and wave the breast before the Lord as a wave offering. The priest shall put the fat on the altar, but the breast, God says, belongs to Aaron and his sons. Verse 32, you. Not God. God's saying to who? Moses and the people. You are to give the right thigh of your fellowship offerings to the priests as a contribution. And the son of Aaron who offers the blood and the fat of the fellowship offering shall have the right thigh as his share. And from the fellowship offerings of the Israelites, 34, I have taken the breast that was waved and the thigh that is presented, and I've given them to Aaron the priest and his sons as their regular share from the Israelites. So God and the people are both joining in to provide for the priest and give the priest the things that they ought to have. Okay? Any questions about this part before we pivot back?
Yeah. Not a question, but a comment. There are a lot of Israelites.
There are a lot of Israelites.
There are a lot of priests. There are a lot of sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
But Aaron and his sons are going to be provided for them.
Right.
God's really feeding them.
He's feeding them. He's taking care of them. I mean, these are his people. And so this is the fellowship offering. All the other offerings are for the things you've done wrong. This offering is that relationship response of, I don't have to come because it's wrong. I get to come because it's right. Because I love you, Lord, and because of what you've done, and because you have provided for me, and I promised you I would do something, and here it is, or because you've taken care of me when I was about to die, and I just want to give this back to you and say thank you. Whole thing wrapped up. They're supposed to take the rest of the meat, and they're supposed to, depending on the rules of how it was offered, eat it that day or eat it the next day. But it's literally we brought something to give to God, and God actually winds giving it back to us. Winds up giving it back to us in the kind of way where, I mean, you'd eat this with your friends. You'd eat this with your family. You'd eat this in the kind of way where you celebrated the provision of God. This is kind of like what we do without the trappings of the sacrificial system here when we come together and we have that fellowship meal time. Because we literally are bringing our things to say, thank you, Lord, for what you've done in one way or another, and we get to share in it together. And most of the time we eat most of it there, right? Take some of it home. Pivot back to 1 Samuel 2. Because against the backdrop of God saying, this is what you're supposed to do with this, Eli's sons have their own idea. Starting in verse 13. Now it was the practice of the priests with the people that whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, and while the meat was being boiled, the servant of the priest would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand. He'd plunge it into the pan or the kettle or the cauldron or the pot, and the priest would take for himself whatever the fork brought up. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. This is not the problem. Okay? This is the custom that grew out of it in that kind of way and how they did it. Verse 15, but even before the fat was burned, the servant of the priest would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept the boiled meat from you, only raw. If the man first said to him, let the fat be burnt up first, and then take whatever you want, which, church, is that in line with what we just read? That is, actually. Because we're giving the fat to God. Let it be burned up, and then take the part that you want. The servant would then answer, No. Hand it over now, and if you don't, I'll take it by force. Why? Because I want the fat. Because I want the tasty meat. Because I don't care that this is God's part. I'm going to take this for myself. And so when you get down to verse 17 and it says, this sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with, and there's that word, contempt. Now that word pops off the page, right? We understand we're literally going into God's part of what he set up as this is how you're communicating your reverence to me, your gratefulness to me, and you're doing it by reaching into the part you're giving me and you're taking it away from someone who's offering it. You don't care. You are so selfish, you want it for yourself. That's not the only thing you're doing. Go on down to, I did not write that there. I apologize. I thought this was in my notes. Because I need to point to it. Verse 22. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and, number 2, how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. This is exactly what you think it is. But while we will react to that and say, okay, no, that's immoral and that's wrong. It is. Let me be very clear on saying that it is. That's not the reason why God is angry. Okay? In fact, if you look at the Old Testament laws that they have in the Torah, it has a lot more to say about sleeping with people you're related to and sleeping with men and other stuff like that. You're not supposed to do it. But the thing that really hits home here for the fact that they're priests has to do with a different part of Leviticus. Turn over to Leviticus 15. Leviticus 15, and this will start in verse 16. Okay? When a man has an emission of semen, he must bathe his whole body with water, and he'll be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather that has it on it must be washed with water, and it will be unclean until evening. And when a man lies with a woman, and there is an emission, both of them must bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. Look down to verse 31. You must keep the Israelites separate, because it talks about other things. You must keep the Israelites separate from the things that make them unclean, so that they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling where? My dwelling place, which is among them. Okay? God wants them to stay clean in themselves. Again, they don't have some of the same kind of sanitation stuff that they do. So God's saying, when this happens, you're going to need to be able to step away from that and wash and be clean, and you're not going to be unclean until the next evening that comes up. If that happens during the night, it's the following evening. Okay? Because remember, the day starts at 6 p.m. for them. So literally, if the sons of Eli do this, and then they get up the next morning, and they go to offer sacrifices, they're unclean. And if they do this day after day after day, then day after day they're offering not only uncleanness in the sacrifices, but look back at 31. They're doing it in the dwelling place of God, which all these people are coming to. They're eating there. The chance of infection, okay? Again, look at it from a scientific perspective, is huge because they don't have the same kind of systems that we had in our time. So God used the going outside the camp, being removed from other people, being washed, being clean, have the priest check the spots on your arm, those kinds of things to protect his people from these health things that would come up. But even beyond the fact that they're health things is that foundational thing of God said, do it this way, don't do it that way. And so you got the sons treating the sacrifice with contempt, and you got the sons treating themselves and what God has said about the purity of themselves coming in to offer this in worship with contempt. And so when God looks at Eli and he says, you need to do something about this. Verse 22 of go back to 1 Samuel, chapter 2, verse 22. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he said to them, why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, it's not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people. If a man sins against another man, God may mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? Because God is our help. He's the one who's supposed to come in. He's supposed to be the third party, whether it's marriage or whether it's your brother or your sister or whatever it is. Family, non-family, people in the community, period. You always have God there as that third party at your side with power, with love for you to help you. If you have set him as your enemy, who is going to help you? And this is very good advice, isn't it? This is a father rebuking his sons in this way. His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. But Eli speaks to them. God doesn't think it's enough, obviously, because he doesn't, and we can talk about God's part in holding this off again, but all Eli does is talk. Eli, as the high priest, has a responsibility for the worship of God, especially when it comes to his own children. And it's not just one place, which would be enough for him to deal with them. It's multiple ways, in multiple places. If you've still got your Bible open to Leviticus, turn over to chapter 22. Verse 3. These are the rules of the priests. It starts in chapter 21. 22, verse 3. Say to Aaron and his sons, for generations to come, if any of your descendants is ceremonially unclean, or even just read unclean, and yet comes near the sacred offerings that the Israelites consecrate to the Lord, that person must be what, church? You know that scroll that David's supposed to write by hand? Where's he supposed to get that scroll from? The Levites. From Eli and his people, who are supposed to know this. Look down in verse 9. The priests are to keep my requirements, so they do not become guilty and die for treating them with, there's that word again. God's not just gotten mad one day and said, I'm done with you guys. And it's not because he's unfair to Eli or his sons and he's stepping in between a father's advice to his sons and saying, no, I'm going to keep this from happening because I just really want to get him. Eli is not being faithful with the text. Does Eli know the text? He should. But again, this is the thing that we looked at with David. And let's be very clear. Human beings are flawed. Human beings don't always get it right. Even the man after God's own heart, we've looked at for how many weeks, and time and again, he doesn't get it right. But God is there with him to help steer him back on course. That's why when he's going to kill Nabal, Abigail shows up. Because God is that third person who's there to help him in that kind of way. But here, fact, let me reread verse 9. The priests are to keep my requirements so that they do not become guilty and die for treating them with contempt. Because the verse doesn't stop there. I am the Lord who makes them holy, who sets them apart, who has made them in this kind of way, in essence, for his own use. If you're treating the things that I make in this kind of a way, what you're actually saying is you don't need to treat me as holy. And that's their heart over and over and over again. You're like, Nathan, it's almost 6:45. We're talking about Uzzah. Well, we are. Eli knows he does nothing to stop them. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, we're so familiar with Samuel being told by God, I've got this message for you. But the message is about Eli and his sons. And you look in verse 13, God's even telling to Eli, this is 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 13. God says, in fact, let me back up to 11. The Lord said to Samuel, see, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears of it tingle. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family, from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them. As the priest, he should have removed them. As the priest, it's your sons. You're trying, as a father, you want your sons to follow along the right path, but this is so blatant that what happens is you get into, and we didn't cover these chapters together. We started in 1 Samuel 8 with Samuel being rejected by the people and Saul coming onto the scene. In 1 Samuel 4, the people get defeated by the Philistines and they say, what went wrong? We need the Spirit of God with us. Let's take the Ark of the Covenant and let's go. And God will help us defeat them in battle because we've got his very presence with us. And it's a total disaster, and they lose the Ark. Hophni and Phinehas are killed, we're told in the text, because it's God's judgment against them. And the same day Eli hears about it, falls backwards on his chair, breaks his neck, and he dies. All three of them are wiped out so that part of the line can no longer be priests before God because of the seriousness that God has with this. Now, play what if with me for a moment. Because God has the power. I mean, if you've got Hophni and Phinehas carrying the ark into battle, they might have died in the battle with the Philistines. Okay? If they're there. They might have died anyway. But if God's trying to protect his line of priests, he may have just as easily protected them from dying. And so instead of the ark going into Philistine hands, it's the ark and the priests going into Philistine hands for the months that it was among the priests. Hophni and Phinehas, if they had been good, godly, righteous men, could have spoken to the Philistines and said, hey, God is great. This is how you handle it. The Philistines come up with this whole thing with the cart themselves. Because, and you can read about this in chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, all the way through here. The ark is there. It's causing these tumors, these infestations of rats in their major cities. And they're finally like, we don't want it. Get rid of it. Send it away. And so they put it on this cart and they literally make this test of either it'll turn towards the Israel's territory, the Israelite territory. And if it does, we know it's from God. We'll let it go. But if it doesn't, then we're just making this all up in our heads. We'll pick it up and it'll come back. The cart goes, it turns towards the Israelites, and they let it go. And the cart comes to this town called Beth Shemesh. And you want to look at Uzzah being struck down for what had happened here. But the people of Beth Shemesh, this is 1 Samuel 6, verses 13 through 20. They see the ark come up on this cart. They know what it is. And they go and they touch it and they open it. And they look inside of it. And God strikes down 70 people. You want to say why did God strike down Uzzah? Let's add the people there to this conversation. Why does God strike down 71 people over how this is handled? Because he's holy. And because they haven't taken the time to understand. They've missed it. They're not with him in the ways that they need to be with him. If Hophni and Phinehas are godly and they're going out with the ark, are they there then? Is somebody there to explain to the people, hey, no, don't touch this. God said this is holy. Are they able to say to the Philistines, this can't go out on a cart. This is supposed to be carried on poles. Why? Because we know. And because God's things are supposed to be taken care of. Maybe it even wouldn't be them. They're not of the line that's supposed to carry the stuff. So maybe it's somebody else who's part of the Kohathites that we were talking about last week. But God in his power could have protected all of them. So you have the Philistines, you have the people in Beth Shemesh. They get decimated, so they're like, we don't want to keep this thing around. And they look around, and the people in Kiriath Jearim, which is where David goes to get the ark to begin with. It looks like this is some kind of a sanctuary or possibly a religious shrine in some way. We're not sure. We don't know. But it's enough to where they're like, hey, that's a good idea. It can go there. So it goes to Abinadab's house, and it stays there for at least 20 years. His son, Eleazar, is consecrated to guard the ark, but he's not of this descent in any kind of way that we know of. And Uzzah is actually one of Eleazar's brothers. So question marks upon question marks. If that's the case, why isn't Uzzah consecrated? Or was he? And the text doesn't tell us. And where's Eleazar when they're carrying it out? We don't know. In fact, looking at the time, let's talk about that next week. But as far as Eli and his sons, if this knowledge had come, doesn't that protect the people in Beth Shemesh? Doesn't that protect Uzzah? If the priests are there to say, you can't do this in this kind of way. And you can walk it back to God's executing his judgment against Eli and his family because Eli wasn't willing to do what he needed to do as the priest. And we don't ever talk about him in this context. The small things, the things that we tell ourselves are small things, are not small things when it comes to the holiness of God. And the ways where we, as human beings, reason with ourselves and tell ourselves we can cut corners. We can't. And God puts these stories in here to remind us why. But why does Uzzah die? Partly because of the unfaithfulness of Eli with his sons. And if he had done what he should have done, that doesn't mean that they make it all the way there. Okay? Again, we're playing what if and we don't know. But they're missing a priest. They're missing someone to tell them, this is the holy ark of God. You can't touch it. And God, may you be gracious to us in our times of trial for faithfulness to you. Because so often, don't we think that when we cut those corners, it's only going to affect ourselves or our family if it goes beyond that. I mean, this is 20 years later, and a man loses his life in a way that, again, I'm not saying 100% sure that it could have stopped, but at least they would have had the information close to them to know. What do you guys think? I've monologued enough tonight, but I kind of looked at where we are and said, I've got to cover this territory. What do you think? Eli and his sons and everything else. Do you have any questions about what we've gone over?
Stupid comment.
There are no stupid comments here.
Witnessing the declaration of respect for rules and hierarchy and study classes. Is it possible that it starts over here, it gets to David, and nobody even knows to tell him this was? he know he was supposed to write the 5 books?
Did David know he was supposed to write the 5 books?
You got Eli and his sons going, it's
That's
one travels from another to another to another, by the time, it's like playing telephone, by the time it gets to David, then
Bill. Why would you think that's a stupid question? That's a great question.
that's probably in it.
That's a great. No. I mean, this is humanity. I mean, the gap between Moses and where they are. I mean, you've got all of these judges that come through between Moses and Samuel, and Moses and David that come through there. So, can you have the escape from even understanding that that's there in the text? Yeah, you sure can. But not for a people who are supposed to be people of the word, and not for the Levites. The Levites are supposed to know. They're supposed to be in this text. I mean, this text is literally what's guiding their lives. And this is what Moses says to them in Deuteronomy at the end. Look, choose this. Choose who you're going to serve. And Joshua echoes this later on at the end of Joshua. Moses in Deuteronomy is, I set before you blessings and curses. Choose the blessings. But when you choose the curses, because we know you're going to, come back to the Lord, and he will restore you because he loves you. Deuteronomy is such a wonderful book. Joshua, choose for you this day who you're going to serve, whether it's this God or that other God. But for me and my house, we're going to choose the one that got us here and who we've stood in his power for so long. And then generation after generation, in Judges, that cycle, the people step away, but then they come back. And they come back. I mean, you have in Ezra where the people have lost the text, and they open it up and they hear the word of God read, and they weep because of this great store of knowledge and everything else in there. Some of it they didn't know. So I don't know that we can give you a definite answer outside of they should have. And the priests, the Levites especially, should have been the ones. That council in 1 Samuel 8, where they're talking about appointing a king, should have set off red flags for the Levites. Moses talked about this. We've got rules we know what's going to go on with this. Here's a good question. Did Saul have to write this down? And if he didn't, would that have changed the course of his kingship? We don't know. Some things we don't know. But we can definitely pull this lesson from this. If they had been in the text the way they should have been in the text, the protection of God would be with them in whatever way they needed it. This story of Uzzah is not about a God who finally just lost his temper and acted out. This is about a God who repeatedly, over many people and many different times, was ignored and ignored and ignored and ignored. And he finally said, either I have to do something about this or what I'm saying means nothing. And hopefully for us, we don't have to get to the point with where Uzzah was, where we have to learn that as well. So next week, I finally want to pivot to Uzzah. But now I do it within the context of all of this to say, we've seen what the law says. We've seen what they should have done. And we can judge a little bit more about the goodness and rightness of God instead of just saying, well, we're going to trust God, even though we have a bad feeling about this. Because we shouldn't have a bad feeling. God has done what he's done in the righteous and right way. This is his character.
Can I trust it?
Sure.
I've already looked at the clock. Lisa just asked me a question. It's got such an impact to it. It gets me. By the time you get to Jesus' age, they've been carried off to Babylon. They've established the synagogues, which they didn't have at this time we're studying not. One of the customs they had, the Jews in Jesus' age, is all the young boys are supposed to memorize the first 5 books. Mm-hmm. Not just the king writes it down, but they're supposed to memorize it, and they're the ones that are going out, joining the crowd, saying, crucify him.
Yeah.
So, humanity.
Yeah.
If you look at Bill, at the question of did he know, did they all know? Humanity's lazy. The kings are supposed to memorize it. At Jesus' time, all the boys are supposed to memorize it, and they mainly do.
In fact, that's actually a step further, because kings are supposed to write it down and they're supposed to read it every day.
Yes.
But the text doesn't say specifically they have to remember, but they should by that point. I mean, they're making judgments based on this law. But to go through that first level of the teaching to where you memorize cold Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
And
From
so
memory.
generations passed from us. We can't find the Bible at the courthouse. Go get Brother Brown from the Church of Christ. He's got more Bible in his head. We'll swear on his head.
Yep.
That's the old preacher's story. We've heard it.
Yeah.
Our generation today's fallen away from that.
I
Used to
think
be.
the churches of today are falling away
Huh?
from it. Churches have got to where they're so accepting of all these things that's going on in society that we're supposed to accept as normal.
Yes.
And that's not what the Bible says.
Well, and it really comes down to the question of what is our standard?
Right.
And whether the church will choose to shift its standard. Is our standard going to be what the world currently thinks? Because that changes from generation to generation and time to time. Or are we going to say, as close as we can, this is our guide? You're fine. You're fine. This is our guide, and God is good.
Didn't mean to interrupt you.
No,
You're fine.
no.
You got just as much floor as I do.
No.
I'm just listening in class.
In fact, family, I kind of want to go for another hour and just like do the rest of this out. But this is where we need to put a pause on it. So why don't we come back to that thought and all the rest of this before we talk about Uzzah and his responsibility and God breaking out against Uzzah. Leon, are you doing the prayer tonight?
Yep.
All right, brother. Take us to the throne of God.
And Father, we thank you for your son coming down to down cross. We thank you for your son raised from the dead to ascend him back into that. We thank you for being a blessing. We thank you for waking us up this night, showing us a new day. Thank you for my life. Thank you for bless those that stay in the house of wherever. Thank you. Thank you for just all over the nation. Let them all teach the same thing. Let us love everybody the same way. Bless Jim and Tim, children, and the rest of us. Forgive us for our sins. We all in sin and change short. We love you. This is my prayer. In Jesus' name.